July of 1877, workers at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company in the town of Martinsburg, West Virginia, reached a boiling point when their wages were slashed 10%. This was the second time in 8 months that the workers' pay had been cut, all the while being expected to continue the same level of work. These hardworking men were required to be away from their families for far longer than they wanted. They were working long, tenuous hours, and this pay cut was the last straw. The train cars were rounded up and put in the roundhouse, and the trainmen of the B&O Company told officials that the cars would stay there. No trains would leave the roundhouse, and business would not resume until their pay was restored to the previous level. This was the first of many very, very reasonable demands that workers are going to make to bosses, police, and the government over the course of this video. But it was, very predictably, met with pushback. The strike at the B&O yard was on, and their demand was clear.
The mayor of Martinsburg, West Virginia, arrived at the train yard with the goal of ending the strike, and he was booed when he spoke to the crowd. He tried to encourage people to get the trains moving again, but there was no one there who was willing to scab against the railroad men striking. The mayor's next attempt to quell the uprising was to order the arrest of the strike leaders. The strike leaders just laughed at this order. And the police did nothing, partially because they were so vastly outnumbered by the train workers. But this sets a pattern that we're going to see quite a bit today. Workers assert collective action, and the power of the state is immediately called upon to arrest or sometimes hurt and kill the strikers. Later that night at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company, higher-ups at the B&O office telegraphed for militiamen, an armed regiment to bring the strike to an end. They arrived, and 2 people were killed in Martinsburg while trying to derail a train covered with militiamen, one on each side of the conflict.
The conflict escalated when the president of the B&O Company wired people in Washington, D.C., asking for federal troops to break the strike. He wanted the U.S. Army to act against U.S. citizens, writing, "The loss of an hour of labor would most seriously affect us and imperil vast interests." U.S. President Rutherford B. Hayes complied, sending 300 soldiers. The workers in Martinsburg did fight back against the army, but the 300 soldiers were able to take back control of the railroad yards, and the strike seemed to lose steam with the army in control and leaders in custody. It wasn't really over, though, as people around Martinsburg saw what happened there, and trains were ambushed in surrounding communities. People of other professions like dock workers, as well as unemployed people, united across racial lines to slow down and sabotage business in support of the strikers. Therefore, let the clashing of arms be heard, a handbill read. In view of the rights and in the defense of our families, we shall conquer or we shall die.
The workers at the B&O Company were really not asking for a lot, more like some basic dignity. Working conditions were awful, pay was being cut, and they decided they would hold out for better. Across the United States, this movement spread into what has become known as the Great Upheaval. People across the country protested and were met with violence. When I first learned about the Great Upheaval, I had some serious déjà vu. This series of events sounds exactly like what's happening right now. Even though we're 145 years on from those strikes, it kind of feels like the lines have been changed, but the play is the same. In the summer of 2020, like many other Americans, we marched in support of Black Lives Matter and against police brutality toward people of color. The murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Elijah McClain were merely the last straw for a lot of folks, like that pay cut for the railroad workers all those decades ago. Police responded to those protests across the country with escalating violence. I cannot even count how many people I know who were tear-gassed while peacefully protesting.
Additionally, right now in 2022, we're seeing what I guess is being termed the Great Resignation, where people who are commonly working 2 or 3 jobs for unacceptable pay and who are strapped with immense student loans are holding out for better job opportunities, all while receiving intense criticism from people who seem to think they're just being whiny little babies for not pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps. A phrase which people too often seem to forget is meant to denote impossibility. They're tired of their hours being cut or being reclassified as independent contractors so that companies can avoid treating them like human beings. But this is just our prologue, actually. The Great Upheaval set the table for the Haymarket Affair, an all too forgotten, completely under-taught chapter of American labor history, which eerily echoes today's struggles.
Hi, I'm Dan.
And I'm Jake, and we're both public high school teachers. August Spies was a German immigrant who immigrated to the United States in 1872 when he was just a teenager. Spies settled in Chicago, where he worked as an upholsterer for a time. He carried an air of intelligence about him, and between his haircut, mustache, and prolific writing, strikes me as a less depressed Edgar Allan Poe. Having come from a fairly well-to-do childhood in Germany, Spies was surprised by the injustices that he witnessed among the working class in Chicago, which ended up attracting him to socialism. By 1877, he had joined the Socialist Labor Party and gained a reputation for being one of the more militant leaders within the group. He encouraged members of the SLP to wear military-style uniforms and carry muskets, which drew the ire of many in the party. Eventually, he joined the staff of the workers' newspaper in Chicago, the Arbeiter Zeitung, and became its editor in 1884. The Arbeiter Zeitung was founded by veterans of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which started at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company. Spies would work and write at the Arbeiter Zeitung until he was arrested in 1886.
The working conditions that August Spies saw around him were deplorable. Chicago, as one of the industrial centers of the United States, operated as a complex network of factories and stockyards, which turned raw materials into finished products and turned human beings into extremely small, expendable parts of a machine. It was a meat grinder that cared 0% for the needs of its common worker simply because it wasn't profitable. If someone was hurt or died, they could be replaced by 10,000 more workers clamoring for work of any kind just to survive, and the average person had almost no legal recourse against these behemoth companies. The Encyclopedia of Chicago tracks the development from a burgeoning city center into the industrial power it became, with its influx of immigrant labor and uneducated workers that the system was ready to exploit. Factory operatives needed little training, but they did have to be able to endure long hours in rough conditions. Workers found increasingly impersonal life as hands or operatives, laboring monotonously on a minuscule part of the production of an item for 10 to 14 hours, 6 days a week. In 1880, over 75,000 Chicago workers labored in industries including meatpacking, clothing production, iron and steel, the manufacturing of foundry, machine and agricultural implements, beer and liquor processing, furniture manufacture, and printing. The personal relationship between upper management and workers became increasingly distant as the size of companies grew.
Your average worker was at the mercy of the plant foreman, who was given supreme authority to set the pace of work, employee wages, hours, and delegation of tasks. He could hire and fire at will. This complete lack of autonomy for the average worker was compounded by the fact that there was little certainty or regularity for work. Laborers were often simply called out of a line from the gates of the factory and were employed unsteadily on a day-to-day basis. The parallels to chattel slavery were not lost on these workers just 20 years after the Civil War. This pushed people toward the outlook of a labor republican, saying that the current system of foremen and wages robbed workers of the fruits of their labors and therefore denied them the humanity and rights as citizens. As they tried to find ways to alleviate their suffering or outright tear down that system, many people found socialism and anarchism as desirable alternatives to the wage slavery model.
August Spies saw the struggle and desired to lead it. His speech on May 4th, 1886, which we'll get to in a moment, made all of that clear. At last, the condition of the disinherited producers has become unbearable. Seeing that neither boss nor law would concede anything to them, they have organized for the purpose of helping themselves, a wise and prudent resolution. All over the land we behold vast armies of producers, no longer begging, but demanding that 8 hours shall henceforth constitute a normal working day. And what say the extortionists to this? They demand their pound of flesh. They will yield not one iota. They've grown rich and powerful on your labor. They amass stupendous fortunes while you, who bring them into existence, are suffering from want.
On May 1st, 1886, workers at the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company were part of a wider trade union uprising that was protesting in favor of increased wages and the 8-hour workday, along with tens of thousands of other striking workers across Chicago. Their refrain was, "We're summoning our forces from shipyard, shop, and mill. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will." While the 8-hour workday is largely accepted as standard today, majorly due to strikes like these, it was seen as radical by many in the 1880s, especially company bosses. On Friday night, the workers at the McCormick Company, which primarily made farming equipment, withdrew their labor. The New York Times covered this strike, and they did so without one shred of journalistic integrity. The article terms the strikers a mob of 7,000 or 8,000 anarchist workmen and tramps maddened with free beer and free speech, and ignorant anarchist lumbermen who have been on strike since Friday night.
Accounts of these May Day protests vary, and it's difficult to tell what really happened. Many sources say that they were largely peaceful, and some people say that violence grew over the course of the day, and some, like the New York Times, are completely dismissive of the strikers and paint them as rowdy thugs who don't have a goal or a plan. The protests lasted until May 3rd, at which point strikebreakers were hired by the company bosses and violence erupted. Spies was there and spoke briefly. Outside the McCormick machine plant, police opened fire on the crowd, killing 2 workers and injuring 4 others that would die later that day of their wounds. The police brutality was offensive to the labor organizers, including August Spies, who had spoken just a few minutes before. He ran from the gunfire, his blood boiling, asking, "What kind of hell goddamn business is this?"
What the hell is even that?
He later testified, "I was very indignant. I knew from experience of the past that this butchering of people was done for the express purpose of defeating the 8-hour movement."
In the days following the shooting at the McCormick factory, 340,000 workers withdrew their labor in and around Chicago. Socialist leaders like Spies quickly distributed about 20,000 copies of a handbill calling for a rally on May 4th to protest the incident of police brutality. It was to be held in the evening within the Haymarket Square, a square on Chicago's Des Plaines Street that acted as a farmer's market. The first version of the Haymarket flyer, most copies of which were ultimately destroyed, called for violence, including the line, "Working men, arm yourselves and appear in full force." Spies did not approve this explicit call for violence, though, and refused to speak at the rally unless the flyer was changed. The flyer was reprinted without that sentence on it, and Spies agreed to speak. Spies also drew up a leaflet at the office of the Arbeiterzeitung paper, titling it, "Working Men to Arms." A typesetter named Adolf Fischer added the word "revenge" in all capital letters above it. At about 8:30 on May 4th, 1886, the rally began under a glum wet sky and a brisk wind, which portended what was to come.
There were not as many people in Haymarket Square by the start of the rally as August Spies would have liked, but the crowd may have been as large as 3,000. Speakers for the evening included Spies, Albert Parsons, who is the leader of the American arm of the International Working People's Association, as well as the editor for the labor paper The Alarm, and Reverend Samuel Fielden, who is a member of the Socialist Labor Party, the IWPA, and was a Methodist minister.
Spies spoke first, delivering a very short speech that is transcribed at only about 10 paragraphs. By his estimation, only 15 or 20 minutes long. Having spoken at 2 or 3 events a day for the past several days, he was tired and spoke calmly, a bit more quietly than he was used to. His rhetoric was unchanged, though. He questioned how unjustified violence on behalf of labor protests had been and decried the violence that had been used to keep labor movements down. In a sentiment that has been echoed by everyone from Malcolm X to Dr. King to contemporary leftists, he says that violence was inevitable because the average poor person's condition. Hungry people don't stay hungry for long.
At that point, Albert Parsons arrived with his wife and children, and though he had heard none of Spee's address, Spees invited him to the stage where Parsons spoke for between 45 minutes and an hour. After that, Parsons went to Zeff's Hall on one side of the square for a beer, while Reverend Fielden spoke to the crowd. While the crowd may have swelled to about 6,000 people at some point during the meeting, by the time Fielden was speaking, perhaps 10 at night, numbers had dwindled to about 500. Parsons noticed uniformed police officers when he arrived. 6 companies of police had been stationed at the meeting. Chicago Mayor Carter Harrison was in attendance as well, and when he was satisfied that the meeting would be peaceful, left the square. He told Police Inspector John Bonfield before his departure not to intervene in the labor speeches.
According to Parsons' testimony, Fielden looked like he would be speaking for some time to come. Parsons was anxious to leave since rain was likely and approached his wife to tell her as much. When nearly 200 police officers in blue coats began to descend on the crowd, ordering listeners to disperse. Fielden briefly argued that the protest was peaceful, but quickly acquiesced and began to step down from the hay wagon on which he stood, when an explosion erupted in the middle of the crowd that caused a shockwave of violence. According to Parsons, all at once, looking directly at the meeting, I saw an illumination. It lit up the whole street, and instantly following it, a deafening roar. And following that, almost simultaneously, were volumes of shots, every flash of which it seemed I could see, of course, being in the night. The best comparison I can make since, in my mind, is that it was as though 100 men held in their hands repeating revolvers, self-cockers, and fired them as rapidly as they could be fired until they were all gone. And then the shooting was over.
What Parsons saw was a dynamite bomb that had been thrown in the middle of the meeting. Dynamite was still a new invention at the time, evoking both fascination and fear in the general public with what sort of wonders or horrors it might cause in society. So it makes sense that it was the weapon of choice in the Haymarket. In fact, dynamite was seen by some as the ticket to a successful revolution, with one editorial reading, "Dynamite is an emancipator. In the hand of the enslaved, it cries aloud." Witnesses described the bomb as round, about as big as a baseball, and leaving a trail of smoke from its lit fuse flying above the crowd at quite a vertical angle. When the bomb exploded, many people were injured, and police fired their guns into the crowd, panicking, for a full 2 minutes. When the dust settled, 7 police officers were dead, but most were likely killed in the volley of gunfire and not from the bomb's shrapnel. 4 civilians from the crowd were dead. Spees survived by ducking into Zeff's Hall for cover. More than 100 people had injuries of some kind, but the true number of casualties remains unknown because many wounded strikers did not seek medical aid due to fear of arrest.
Once again, the New York Times sensationalized the deaths and placed blame squarely on the anarchists. Oh my God, New York Times, I love you, but seriously, this is embarrassing. In an article with the headline, "Anarchy's Red Hand," the Times categorized the incident as "the villainous teachings of the anarchists bore bloody fruit in Chicago tonight, and before daylight, at least a dozen stalwart men will have laid down their lives as a tribute to the doctrine of Herr Johann Most."
The riot and the violence was blamed on the labor organizers, because of course it was. You already knew that was coming. An outpouring of support for the police flooded into Chicago, and public opinion changed fast. 8 people were arrested for the bomb throwing. The police claimed that they were all part of a conspiracy to kill police, starting with the conclusion and then working to prove it. The Arbeiterzeitung office was raided, where police arrested August Spees and the typesetter responsible for the "Revenge" line on the To Arms leaflet, Adolf Fischer.
Several other anarchist speakers or activists were arrested, most of whom were German immigrants, and they were put on trial. Collectively, the 8 men, August Spees, Albert Parsons, Samuel Fielden, Louis Ling, Michael Schwab, George Engel, Adolf Fischer, and Oscar Nebe, became known as the Anarchists of Chicago. All of them claimed to know nothing of the bombing. They also denounced the action. Selection of a jury to try the anarchists lasted an excruciatingly long time, as the judge dismissed potential jurors if they expressed any sort of sympathy for either the 8-hour movement or of socialism. Those who were not dismissed were the Chicagoans who supported the police or were openly hostile to leftist politics. Eventually, an anti-union bailiff personally selected all 12 members of the jury. Only those with prejudice against the anarchists would sit.
Despite a rough jury selection process, the legal system did its duty and did provide a fair trial for the defendants. Oh my God, I'm just kidding. Of course it didn't. You're smart. You're seeing the pattern here. The legal proceedings didn't get any better once the trial actually began in late June 1886. Judge Joseph Gary, who presided over the trial, was a little goblin who actually had some dope sideburns. He was clearly hostile to the defendants and ruled in favor of the prosecution repeatedly. The 8 motioned to be tried separately, and that was denied. It was difficult for the prosecution to pin any of the 8 men to the crime. Several of them were clearly not the bomb throwers because they were either speaking from the hay wagon within view of the whole crowd, or they were having a beer at Zeff's Hall when the explosion happened. One of them, Louis Ling, was a bomb maker, but it wasn't clear that he made the bomb that was thrown in the square. George Ingle and Michael Schwab were not even present at the Haymarket meeting. Ingle was home playing cards, while Schwab was speaking at an entirely different event during the bombing. The prosecution made the claim that printing the word Ruhe, the German word for peace or quiet, in the Arbeiter Zeitung was some kind of signal, a confirmation to throw the bomb that night. But they couldn't produce any evidence that that was true.
Seeing as the prosecution was so clearly unable to prove beyond a doubt that any of the 8 defendants had made or thrown the bomb, the state instead focused on previous writings and speeches given by the men, saying that they were tacitly responsible for the bomb because of their leftist rhetoric. The opinion of the court, written by Judge Benjamin Magruder, instead of laying out how the defendants committed the crime, makes frequent quotations of things that the anarchists said in the months and years leading up to the Haymarket meeting. Quotes about revolution, about dynamite and working men, and abolition of private property were included in the decision. Prosecutor and total gremlin Julius Grinnell even conceded on the floor of the court that the bomber was not in the room, so that the jury could instead consider who encouraged the bomber to action. Essentially, the argument was that the defendants hadn't done enough to dissuade the potential bomber.
Now, we're not legal scholars, and we're not going to pretend to be. We've seen enough posts on the Bad Legal Takes Twitter account to know that we don't want to end up there. But the verdict feels kind of thin from a layman's perspective. About 40 years after the Haymarket trial, a similar court case revolving around incitement to violence played out in Gitlow v. New York. They decided the state cannot reasonably be required to measure the danger from every such utterance to the nice balance of a jeweler's scale. A single revolutionary spark may kindle a fire that, smoldering for a time, may burst into a sweeping and destructive conflagration. And it is said that this manifesto was more than a theory, that it was incitement. Every idea is incitement. It offers itself for belief, and if believed, it is acted upon unless some other belief outweighs it or some failure of energy stifles the movement at its birth. The only difference between the expression of an opinion and incitement in the narrower sense is the speaker's enthusiasm for the result. Eloquence may set fire to reason.
Prosecutors framed the trial as a defense of democracy itself. Defense attorney William Black, on the other hand, closed his argument by quoting Jesus, who he referred to as the divine socialist. As ye would that others should do to you, do even so to them. Unsurprisingly, a guilty verdict was turned in for all 8 men. In the sentencing, Oscar Nebe retorted to police captain Michael Schack that the Chicago PD was far more dangerous a gang than anyone involved in the labor movement, and said that there was not much difference between the two. You are an anarchist as you understand it, he told Schack. You are all anarchists in this sense of the word. Schack was later dismissed from the police force for fabricating evidence in this case, but was reinstated later, because consequences only exist for some people.
I had a moment of self-reflection when it came to the verdict. We felt that the 8 defendants clearly should not have been deemed guilty for the bombing, especially since the decision was that they were guilty of aiding and abetting a murder without a murderer ever having been identified. However, we had flashbacks to the trials of Capitol insurrectionists, and we certainly feel like Donald Trump bears some responsibility for inciting that incident with his speech, at least morally, if not legally. So we've been sitting with that thought and seeing how our own beliefs affect our opinions on those trials. Holding up a mirror to your own preconceived notions is always a good thing.
7 of the 8 anarchists were sentenced to death by hanging. One was sentenced to 15 years in prison. While the Chicago Tribune reported that the men had been fairly prosecuted and ably defended under the processes of the law which they would have throttled, and that there was universal satisfaction with the verdict, there was considerable outcry by well-known figures like lawyer Clarence Darrow and authors George Bernard Shaw and Oscar Wilde. The men quickly became martyrs for the labor movement. Fielding's and Schwab's death sentences were commuted to life in prison by later governor of Illinois, Richard Oglesby, and Louis Ling committed suicide in his cell. He smuggled a blasting cap into the prison and held it in his mouth, blowing off half his face and causing him to die an excruciatingly painful death over the next 6 hours. On November 11th, 1887, August Spies, George Ingle, Adolph Fisher, and Albert Parsons were marched to the gallows in white robes and hoods. They sang La Marseillaise, France's anthem for revolution. Spies was far more eloquent than most of us could ever hope to be in that situation, saying, "The time will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangle today." 2 of them cried, "Hurrah for anarchism," and Parsons was cut off when he began to speak as the trapdoor dropped the 4 men to their deaths. In 1893, those who had not been hanged, Samuel Fielding, Michael Schwab, and Oscar Nebe, were pardoned.
So let's review. During the Great Upheaval, the state used the power of the police to break the strike and try to break the movement. In Chicago, the McCormick Machine Company used the power of the police to break the strike and end the movement. Following the thrown bomb in the Haymarket, the state arrested labor leaders and used the power of the legal system to execute or detain people unfairly in an attempt to end the movement. Then it pinned the crime on leaders of the movement and hanged them after a trial that was the very definition of fixed. Violence is simply not considered violence when it is committed against progressive figures. It then falls under the banner of law and order, even if the actions of the state are against the letter of the law and cause further disorder completely unjustified. It wasn't that long ago that I first heard the definition of government as the sole entity that has a monopoly on violence, and I've been thinking about that constantly ever since. When the government or agents of the government, like military and police, commit violence, we don't frame it that way. Listen to August Spies' testimony as to why he shouldn't hang for the Haymarket bomb. "No," I repeat, "the prosecution has not established our legal guilt, and notwithstanding the purchased and perjured testimony of some, notwithstanding the originality of the proceedings of this trial, and as long as it has not been done, and you pronounce upon us the sentence of an appointed vigilance committee acting as a jury, I say you, the alleged representatives and high priests of law and order, are the real and only lawbreakers, and in this case, to the extent of murder." I sure wish I could say things had changed in the 14 decades since.
Let's move up in time just a little bit, to the turn of the 20th century, and do some English class. Upton Sinclair, the author and activist best known for being played by Bill Nye the Science Guy in David Fincher's Mank, published The Jungle in 1906. Sinclair was famously a socialist and even campaigned for governorship of California, but was defeated in the election. He wrote The Jungle to bring light to the problems of the working conditions in Chicago. Everyone who read it seems, was only able to focus on the absolute putrefaction of the meat industry, which I'll admit is a gross highlight of the book. However, I do not understand how people missed the socialist point of the novel. It's even dedicated to the working men of America.
Even more importantly, the book ends with a character giving a rousing speech to the exploited immigrant laborers. This election will pass, and the excitement will die, and people will forget about it. And if you forget about it too, if you sink back and rest upon your oars, we shall lose this vote that we have polled today, and our enemies will laugh us to scorn. Sinclair lets this class consciousness tirade continue on for pages, ending, "We shall have the sham reformers self-stultified and self-convicted. We shall have the radical democracy left without a lie with which to cover its nakedness. We shall bear down the opposition. We shall sweep it before us. And Chicago will be ours. Chicago will be ours. Chicago will be ours."
Couple these passages with Sinclair's definition of propaganda. Propaganda may be either good or bad, according to the nature of the teaching and the motives of the teacher. It gives a painful wretch to be told that there are moral excellences and heroic splendors in the souls of unwashed and unbeaten working men. Such distinction between art and propaganda is purely a class distinction, and a class weapon itself is a piece of ruling class propaganda, a means of duping the minds of men and keeping them enslaved to the false standards of both art and life. By that definition, any piece of media trying to convince you that you are worth more, that you have dignity and should be valued over money, fits the description of propaganda, including this video. Does that 100-year-old text not sound like the fervor held by people like us who have grown increasingly disaffected with the rank-and-file Democratic Party and look to something a little less milquetoast?
We don't have to stick to history textbooks or literature class to see that nonviolent leftist protest is met with violence, while violent rightist protest is met with complacency and complicit officials. In the summer of 2020, we marched in support of those seeking justice for Elijah McClain, an innocent young man who was killed by police. Justice was not delivered to Elijah because the state doesn't want to see his killing as murder. We marched out onto a highway, Interstate 225 in Aurora, Colorado, where, importantly, all cars were stopped and people walked down the empty road. About 10 minutes after we got onto the highway, we heard screaming behind us and dove off the road with dozens of other people. An SUV had tried to run us over. A man pulled out a gun and emptied it, firing in the direction of the SUV. Let me be clear, that man was in the wrong. That was a dangerous, stupid thing to do. I'm not arguing that. I'm bringing this up because the man with the gun was arrested and charged. The man in the SUV was not arrested, was not charged with any crime. Leaders of those Elijah McClain protests were arrested and detained illegally for a long time because the state uses the power of the legal system to try to detain leaders and try to break the movement, but seemingly only when the protest is from the left. You likely saw something like this wherein perhaps the most discussed event of 2021, the January 6th Capitol insurrection, the violent far-right mobs took selfies with cops and were met with a shrug before things really got out of hand. That's because nonviolent leftist protest is always seen as less acceptable by the state than rightist violence.
So, we've seen this before. If we do our homework and learn from history, I wonder if we can tell or change how it ends. Let's finish with a paraphrase of August Spies. Those in charge have sensed your discontent. They do not like when they have to feel our discontent. It's an uphill battle, but it isn't a lost cause. August Spies and the others died for the 8-hour workday. And now, most people don't even realize that was something that had to be fought for. I wonder what we won't have to fight for in another 100 years. Happy May Day, everybody.